For just a moment, it looked like the Middle East was finally beginning to calm down. After months of missile strikes, air raids, and one of the most dangerous confrontations in recent history, a fragile ceasefire had given the world hope that the worst might finally be over. But that hope didn't last long. Earlier today, the United States launched another major wave of military strikes against Iran. According to U.S. Central Command, the operation targeted more than 80 military sites, including air defense systems, command centers, coastal radar installations, anti-ship missile facilities, and dozens of Revolutionary Guard naval boats operating near the Strait of Hormuz. The United States says the strikes were intended to reduce Iran's ability to threaten one of the world's most important shipping lanes following attacks on commercial vessels. Iran, however, has condemned the strikes as a major escalation and warned that it will respond. But here's what makes today's events even more significant. Just hours after these strikes, Donald Trump arrived at the NATO summit in Ankara. A meeting that was already expected to shape the future of the military alliance has suddenly become something much bigger. Because this summit is no longer just about Europe. It's about Iran. It's about global security. And it may determine whether this conflict remains regional or grows into something the entire world will have to deal with. At first glance, today's strikes might seem like just another chapter in the long-running conflict between the United States and Iran. But according to Washington, this wasn't a surprise attack. It was a response. Just days after a fragile ceasefire had begun easing tensions, 3 commercial vessels sailing through the Strait of Hormuz were hit. The United States says Iran was responsible for those attacks, while Iran has denied the accusations and insists that Washington is using the incident as a justification for expanding military operations. So, why is everyone suddenly talking about one narrow stretch of water? Because the Strait of Hormuz isn't just another shipping route. It is one of the most strategically important waterways on Earth. Every single day, millions of barrels of crude oil and other energy supplies pass through this narrow passage connecting the Persian Gulf to the Arabian Sea. For countries across Europe, Asia, and beyond, this route is an economic lifeline. If traffic through the Strait of Hormuz is disrupted, oil prices can rise within hours, shipping costs increase, insurance premiums jump, and the effects are felt far beyond the Middle East, reaching fuel stations, factories, and financial markets around the world. That is exactly what happened today. Following reports of the latest U.S. strikes, global oil prices moved higher as traders worried that the fragile ceasefire might be collapsing. According to U.S. Central Command, the latest operation wasn't limited to just a handful of targets. American aircraft struck more than 80 Iranian military positions, including air defense systems, command and control centers, coastal radar installations, anti-ship missile batteries, and dozens of boats operated by Iran's Revolutionary Guard near the Strait of Hormuz. The stated objective was to reduce Iran's ability to threaten international shipping and regional security. But Tehran sees the situation very differently. Iranian officials have condemned the strikes as a violation of the fragile ceasefire and warned that the country will defend its territory and respond if further attacks continue. And that's where today's story becomes much bigger than another exchange of missiles. Because while explosions echoed across southern Iran, another conversation was unfolding nearly 2,000 kilometers away, inside a NATO summit where world leaders were preparing to discuss the future of the alliance. And suddenly the conflict in the Middle East was no longer just a regional crisis. It had become a test of NATO itself. While fighter jets were returning from their missions over Iran, another battle was beginning, not on a battlefield, but around a conference table. Thousands of kilometers away, leaders from all 32 NATO member countries gathered in Ankara, Turkey, for what was already expected to be one of the alliance's most important summits in years. But after today's military strikes, everything changed. Suddenly, the conversation was no longer just about Russia or the war in Ukraine. It was also about the growing crisis in the Middle East. And once again, Donald Trump arrived with a message he has repeated for years. America cannot carry the burden alone. For a long time, Trump has argued that while the United States spends enormous resources defending the Western alliance, many European countries have relied too heavily on American military power. His argument has always been straightforward. If Europe wants America's protection, Europe must also invest much more in its own defense. Now, the renewed conflict with Iran has given that argument even greater urgency. From Washington's perspective, the United States isn't just helping defend Europe against Russia, it is also protecting international shipping, maintaining military operations in the Middle East, and responding to crises that can quickly affect the global economy. That raises an important question. If multiple conflicts are unfolding at the same time, should the United States continue carrying most of the military responsibility, or should NATO allies be prepared to do much more? That debate became one of the defining issues of today's summit. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte defended the latest U.S. strikes on Iran as absolutely necessary, saying they were a response to violations of the fragile ceasefire. At the same time, he emphasized that European allies and Canada have already begun increasing defense spending, something Trump has called for over many years. Behind closed doors, European leaders were also trying to reassure Washington that they had heard Trump's message. Many NATO members are now working towards significantly higher defense spending targets, investing in new fighter jets, advanced air defense systems, long-range missiles, and surveillance drones, not only because of Russia, but because today's world is becoming increasingly unpredictable. And that's exactly why this summit matters. The missiles that struck Iran today didn't just shake the Middle East, they also changed the conversation inside NATO, because every new conflict forces the alliance to answer the same question: who will defend the West and who will pay for it? But there's another country watching every decision being made inside that room, a country that has no seat at the NATO table, yet could benefit the most if the alliance becomes divided: Russia. While NATO leaders debated defense spending and American forces carried out strikes in Iran, another world leader was watching very closely: Vladimir Putin. For Russia, every major NATO summit is important, but this one carries even greater significance because the alliance is now facing challenges on multiple fronts. The war in Ukraine continues, tensions in the Middle East are rising once again, and military resources are not unlimited. Every missile delivered, every air defense system deployed, and every naval task force assigned to the Middle East raises new questions about how NATO balances its commitments across different regions. That doesn't necessarily mean support for Ukraine will disappear, but it does mean the alliance must constantly make difficult decisions about where to focus its attention and resources. From Moscow's perspective, any sign of disagreement or division within NATO is closely watched. Russian officials have repeatedly argued that the alliance is overstretched and internally divided, while NATO leaders reject that assessment and continue to emphasize unity. But Russia isn't the only country paying attention. China is watching just as closely. Beijing has long depended on stable trade routes through the Middle East, and any disruption in the Strait of Hormuz or a wider regional conflict could affect global supply chains, energy prices, and economic growth. For China, stability in the region is not just a diplomatic priority, it's an economic necessity. That's why Chinese officials have consistently called for restraint and a political solution instead of further military escalation. And then there's the global economy. Whenever conflict threatens the Strait of Hormuz, financial markets react almost immediately. Energy traders begin calculating the risk of supply disruptions, shipping companies prepare for higher insurance costs, and governments around the world start monitoring inflation and fuel prices. Even countries located thousands of kilometers away can feel the economic consequences. That's why events in the Middle East rarely stay in the Middle East. In today's interconnected world, a missile fired in one region can influence fuel prices, shipping costs, and financial markets across the globe within hours. This is no longer just a story about Iran, and it's no longer just a story about NATO. It's a story about how a regional conflict can reshape global security, international trade, and the balance of power among the world's leading nations. And that leads to the biggest question of all: what happens next? Because the answer won't depend on one country alone. It will depend on the decisions made in Washington, Tehran, Brussels, Moscow, and Beijing. So, where does the world go from here? At this moment, no one can say with certainty. But based on what's happening today, there are three possible paths. The first is diplomacy. Despite the latest strikes, both Washington and Tehran could decide that neither side benefits from a wider war. Behind the scenes, regional mediators may continue working to prevent further escalation. If diplomacy succeeds, the Strait of Hormuz could remain open, energy markets may stabilize, and today's military operation could become another chapter in a conflict that was ultimately contained. But for now, that outcome remains far from certain. The second possibility is a cycle of retaliation. History has shown that military action often leads to military response. Iran has already warned that today's strikes will not go unanswered. If retaliation targets American forces, commercial shipping, or regional allies, Washington could respond once again. Every new exchange would increase the risk of a wider regional conflict, and with each escalation, the pressure on NATO allies would continue to grow. The third possibility is the beginning of a new security era. Perhaps the biggest change won't happen on the battlefield at all. It could happen inside NATO itself. For years, Donald Trump has argued that Europe must become more responsible for its own defense. Now, with the war in Ukraine still ongoing and tensions rising once again in the Middle East, many European governments are accelerating military investment. If that trend continues, today's summit may be remembered as a turning point, not because of a single speech or one military strike, but because it marked the beginning of a different NATO, one in which Europe takes on a much larger share of the alliance's security responsibilities. Today's headlines may be about airstrikes, but tomorrow's headlines could be about diplomacy, retaliation, or another emergency summit. No one knows which path events will ultimately take. But one thing is already clear. The strikes carried out today and the discussions taking place inside the NATO summit are connected by a much bigger question. How should the West respond to a world where multiple crises are unfolding at the same time? Because this is no longer just about Iran, and it is no longer just about NATO. It's about the future of global security, the stability of international trade, and whether the world's most powerful nations can prevent regional conflicts from growing into something much larger. Only time will reveal the answer. But whatever happens next, the decisions made this week could shape global politics for years to come. If you found this analysis helpful, don't forget to subscribe to West Global News for in-depth coverage of the stories shaping our world. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.